Hello, how is everyone? And welcome to the lecture on biosocial theory. Today we're going to delve into very quick and easy, quick and dirty, uh, positive school of criminology into what is essentially modern day biosocial theory. So this is coming from the biological perspective, meaning that people have traits that make them more criminal, and sometimes this goes into like the more prehistoric versions. What I mean by prehistoric is not actually prehistoric, but like in the late 1800s, early 1900s, all the way to modern days where we're actually doing brain scans and determining parts of your brain that might be more susceptible to criminality. So let's talk about Cesare Lombroso, who he's called the father of modern sociology. And one of the key tenets that he believed in was that criminals were born and not made. So the whole concept of back talking about the classic school where you had tabula rasa, where people were born a blank slate, the positive approach or the biosocial approach said that you're essentially born a criminal and not made. So those are two very different perspectives at that point. So Lombroso argued that criminality could be identified by physical traits, and what I mean by this is like large jaws, sloping foreheads, asymmetrical faces. Essentially, skull studies is when it came to, and then Sheldon did that as well. But we'll talk about Sheldon in a minute. His work was influenced by Darwin, framing criminals as throwbacks, essentially. You start seeing Lombroso was a little racist. Actually, he was a lot racist. He had races of what would be a criminal, and the highest one wasn't black, but it was second on that list. His highest one was Jew. So you can see where this is going real quick with Lombroso's work. And Lombroso lived in the 1800s, and that's how he thought that criminals were born. So essentially, traits that were more white were less criminal, and traits that were less white were more criminal. So Lombroso was Italian, I believe. So moving on to Sheldon, who built on that determinism, he proposed what you call basically somatype theory. He suggested that body type then correlated with temperament and the propensity for crime. So endomorphs, they were more round and soft. Instead, they were sociable and relaxed. So people that were a little chubby were more sociable and happy. Ectomorphs were the thin and fragile type, were more introverted and restrained. And these mesomorphs, these muscular, athletic guys, they were aggressive, risk-taking, and more likely to be criminal, according to Sheldon. Again, this was kind of shoddy, right? So these are the major players in the positive approach, and you start seeing more positivist thinking coming into like the early 1900s. Lobotomies, for example, people drilling into your brain and getting that's more of a positivist approach to criminality. I mean, and they were a little bit right on that one. If you remove parts of your brain that were aggressive, then yeah, you stop being aggressive. You also stop ceasing to be part of yourself. So earlier forms of that positive included pherenology, which is studying bumps on the skull. And maybe you've seen the Bugs Bunny cartoon where the guy was filling out lumps on your head. Bugs was filling out Elmer Fudd's bald head, and that was a reference to that. These were methods attempted to map that personality on those traits or criminal tendencies onto the brain and skull. So the reason why such approaches are not very good as skull studies and somatyping, they lack empirical support. Empirical support meaning studies in the field that validate this. These were just basic on assumptions in their own research. And as you know, or maybe you don't know, that research can be biased based on the researcher doing that research. You see it happen a lot with like gun studies. And if the NRA does a gun study, they suddenly find that guns aren't so violent for some reason. Or so on and so forth. So neuroscience has shown no fixed criminal type. So ethical issues, these theories fuel discrimination, racism, and eugenics. And as you know, the eugenics movement in Nazi Germany, kind of cleansing things, moved over to North America where we started doing eugenics movements to extinguish bad genes. And what that means by bad genes is at the time, people thought people with mental handicaps had bad genes, so they did things like castrate them, not castrate them. What's the word I'm looking for? Not castrate, sterilize them. And there is a difference between castration and sterilization. So that said, these types of studies led to very bad things. Okay, and by focusing on the physical traits, these approaches denied human agency and the role of the environment in getting those criminal things. So the positive approach is flawed because of the racism, discrimination, and leading eugenics, which is bad. They blame biology while ignoring social, economic, and cultural influences, which is a very important thing when you're doing the social sciences. And this is a social science, meaning we study people and their behaviors. So if you ignore those behaviors, it's not a very good approach. So let's move on to modern biosocial. So modern biosocial criminology recognizes that crime emerges from complex interaction between biology, environment, and that social context, okay? It does not claim that people are born criminals, but something makes them that criminal. So this is how predispositions and brain functioning interact with upbringing, trauma, social conditions. And I want to bring up a story about Phineas Gage, and maybe you've heard about the story of Phineas Gage, where Phineas Gage was a very happy, jovial man that owned a business. He owned a local mining business in this town, and he was a very kind man. Well, one day a rail got stuck, or a contraption got stuck, and it had some essentially volatile, basically a source of explosion, right? And so what ended up happening is he went over and tried to unjam it with a metal rod, and that metal rod started striking the surface of this explosive item, and it ended up firing a rail through his head. Well, he got brain damaged. There was a portion of his brain that was completely ruined, and he recovered, and it was normal for the most part, except his attitude changed. He was now a very mean, sociopathic, hateful man who did not care for anything but himself, and he took advantage of people. He was violent. He became aggressive with others, and that leads us into those brain studies, right? Because when that brain got hit, that part of his brain got hit, he became more violent. And this kind of moves on to Adrian Raine, right? He was a pioneer in neurocriminology, and he studied brain structures and functions linked to that antisocial and violent behavior. So what Raine's research does, he talks about the prefrontal cortex, your prefrontal cortex, if you're looking at the camera, it is this area of your head right here, where that's where think about it as a regulation. So you got your amygdala, which is in the middle of your brain, which is your emotional control center, and then you got your prefrontal cortex, which is that part of your brain that regulates that emotion. Okay, so your amygdala produces emotion and how intense it is, and your prefrontal cortex regulates that emotion. That's how the brain works. So let's say in the case of Phineas Gage, when his prefrontal cortex got damaged, but his amygdala was still intact, he had an emotional regulation he had an emotional control center, an emotional part of the brain, and he lost his regulation and control center for that. So things like anger were way more intense for him now. Things like his conscience, not as much. So those judgment calls, right? So crime is linked to prefrontal cortex dysfunction. So if you're born with a non-functioning prefrontal cortex, for example, you are more likely to be criminal. Adrian Raine did some study on serial killers, people that had a lot of violent past, and he noted when he did the brain scans, the prefrontal cortex, it did not light up nearly as much as their amygdala, and he did it on a normal person. And when the normal person had their brain scan, their prefrontal cortex was actually lighting up in response to their amygdala. Meaning, if you have that part of your brain that does not function as well, then you are more likely to emotional impulse, which also leads to anger, violence, etc. So those amygdala differences are emotional regulation and aggression. And then you saw, as I said, those neuroimaging studies, those violent offenders often showed reduced activities in areas related to self-control. Raine stresses that biology is not destiny. There are environmental factors like child abuse, malnutrition, or lead exposure that can interact with brain vulnerabilities to increase crime risk. Child abuse ends up being a thing called epigenetics. And what epigenetics is your brain starts to form and grow based on the environment you're in. Let's say that you're in an abusive environment while growing up. then your brain starts to adapt to that, and you lose a bit of that empathy regulation, a bit of that ability to feel for other people. And well, that's just how your brain grows. It's just like anything else. You flex a muscle, it grows. You don't flex a muscle, it shrinks. Your body reacts and grows accordingly. So malnutrition also does that, and a lead exposure. So what lead exposure works is a poison, and it is a neurotoxin. So you poison your brain, then naturally your brain is not going to be as good as a non-poison brain, and that includes the prefrontal cortex. So if you're exposed to lead, that is a neurotoxin, which does reduce your prefrontal cortex's ability to regulate. Rain stress is that is not destiny. Remember that. So things like environment it does impact even the biosocial perspective. So that kind of wraps it up with the quick and dirty for biosocial. I gave you the main points, and go ahead and take the reading and look into Adrian Rain's brain studies. It's very interesting. And then I will leave you all with that. Have fun on the writing assignment.